The Tale of the Page Boy and the Silver Goblet. There was once a little page boy who was in service in a stately castle. He was a very good-natured little fellow, and did his duties so willingly and well that everybody liked him, from the great earl whom he served every day on bended knee to the fat old butler whose errands he ran. Now the castle stood on the edge of a cliff overlooking the sea, and although the walls at that side were very thick, in them there was a little postern door which opened onto a narrow flight of steps that led down the face of the cliff to the seashore, so that anyone who liked could go down there in the pleasant summer mornings and bathe in the shimmering sea. On the other side of the castle were gardens and pleasure grounds, opening onto a long stretch of heather-covered moorland which, at last, met a distant range of hills. The little page boy was very fond of going out on this moor when his work was done, for then he could run about as much as he liked, chasing bees, butterflies, and looking for birds' nests when it was nesting time. So one night, when everyone else was asleep, he crept out of the castle by the little postern door and stole down the stone steps, along the seashore, and up onto the moor, and went straight to the fairy knoll. To his delight, he found that what everyone said was true. The top of the knoll was tipped up, and from the opening that was made, rays of light came streaming out. His heart was beating fast with excitement, but gathering his courage, he stooped down and slipped inside the knoll. He found himself in a large room lit by numberless tiny candles, and there, seated around a polished table, were scores of the tiny folk, fairies and elves and gnomes, dressed in green and yellow and pink, blue and lilac and scarlet, in all the colours that you can think of. He stood in a dark corner watching the busy scene in wonder, thinking how strange it was that there should be such a number of these tiny beings living their own lives, all unknown to men, at such a little distance from them, when suddenly someone, he couldn't tell who, gave an order. "Fetch the cup," cried the owner of the unknown voice, and instantly two little fairy pages dressed in scarlet darted from the table to a tiny cupboard in the rock, and returned staggering under the weight of a most beautiful silver cup, richly embossed and lined with gold. He placed it in the middle of the table, and amid clapping of hands and shouts of joy, all the fairies began to drink out of it in turn. And the page could see from where he stood that no one poured wine into it, and yet it was always full, and that the wine that was in it was not always the same kind, but that each fairy, when he grasped its stem, wished for the wine that he loved best, and lo, in a moment the cup was full of it. "'Twould be a fine thing if I could take that cup home with me," thought the page. "No one will believe that I've been here except I have something to show for it." So he bided his time and watched. Presently the fairies noticed him, and instead of being angry at his boldness in entering their abode, as he'd expected they would be, they seemed very pleased to see him, and invited him to a seat at the table. But by and by they grew rude and insolent, and jeered at him for being content to serve mere mortals, telling him that they saw everything that went on at the castle, and making fun of the old butler, whom the page loved with all his heart. They laughed at the food he ate, saying it was only fit for animals, and when any fresh dainty was set on the table by the scarlet-clad pages, they would push the dish across to him, saying, "Taste it, for you'll not have the chance of tasting such things at the castle." At last he could not stand the teasing any longer, and he knew that if he wanted to secure the cup, he must lose no time in doing so. So he suddenly stood up, grasped the stem of the cup tightly in his hand, and said, "I'll drink to you all in water." Instantly the ruby wine was turned to clear, cold water. He raised the cup to his lips, but did not drink from it. With a sudden jerk, he threw the water over the candles, and instantly the room was in darkness. Then, clasping the precious cup tightly in his arms, he sprang to the opening of the knoll, through which he could see the stars glimmering. He was just in time, for it fell to with a crash behind him, and soon he was speeding along the wet, dew-spangled moor with the whole troop of fairies at his heels. They were wild with rage, and from the shrill shouts of fury which they uttered, the page knew well that if they overtook him he need expect no mercy at their hands. And his heart began to sink, for fleet of foot though he was no match for the fairy folk who gained on him steadily. All seemed lost, when a mysterious voice sounded out of the darkness. "If thou wouldst gain the castle door, keep to the black stones on the shore." It was the voice of some poor mortal who for some reason or other had been taken prisoner by the fairies, who were really very malicious little folk, and who did not want a fate to befall the adventurous page boy like his. But the little fellow didn't know this. He had once heard that if anyone walked on the wet sands where the waves had come over them, the fairies could not touch him, and this mysterious sentence brought the saying into his mind. So he turned and dashed panting down to the shore. His feet sank in the dry sand and his breath came in little gasps, and he felt as if he must give up the struggle. But he persevered, and at last, just as the foremost fairies were about to lay hands on him, he jumped across the watermark onto the firm wet sand from which the waves had just receded, and then he knew he was safe. For the little folk could go no step further, but stood on the dry sand, uttering cries of rage and disappointment, while the triumphant page boy ran safely along the shore, his precious cup in his arms, and climbed lightly up the steps in the rock, disappearing through the postern door. For many years after, long after he had grown and become a stately butler, who trained other little page boys to follow in his footsteps, the beautiful cup remained in the castle as a witness of his adventure.